Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our participants in today's webinar. So I think we still have to talk a bit because now people are just joining us step by step. But maybe I can talk a bit further about why we are doing this, with whom we are doing this, and who we have today as a speaker. So first of all, so European Chambers, we are a bit far away from Brussels. This is why we feel it is sometimes good to get insights from Brussels directly. And this is why we arranged this webinar on recent EU's initiatives to achieve resilience in sustainable supply chains. I'm happy that we do this in collaboration with the European Business Organization Worldwide Network, in short, EBOWWN. So it's not only Korea. I'm the president of the EBO, European Chamber of Commerce and Korea, Christoph Haider. But we also have people from 9 other countries joining. So in total, we have now 10 countries from Korea, Japan, but also from Africa, like Senegal, Tanzania, other Asian countries like Vietnam, Sri Lanka. So I don't want to be complete. So I don't want to eat into the speaker's time. That's why I keep myself short. So questions, we have a Q&A box. So please enter your questions there. Luisa, I will introduce Luisa a bit later. Luisa will answer those questions later after her presentation, her verbal presentation. So please, whenever you feel that you would like to raise a question already after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatsoever, please do. And then after the presentation, let's say, Luisa will answer those questions. So now it's time to introduce Luisa Santos. Luisa is the Deputy Director General at BusinessEurope, and I'm always impressed by her deep knowledge about what is happening or what is discussed in Brussels, and respectively about how businesses are viewing this, what the European Commission is working out. Yeah. So I would like now to give Luisa the floor, and so that you enlighten us in the next 30 to 40 minutes about what is happening in Europe at the European Commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and well, good morning, good afternoon. I think good afternoon for most of you watching from many countries in Asia, but also in other places in Africa as well. Well, the objective today is really to give you an overview of some of the initiatives that are being discussed in Brussels, but also to give you a perception of what is the sentiment, both from the political side, but also from the business side right now in Europe and in Brussels. So I would like to start by talking about the main drivers of the debate in Europe at the moment, both for political, but also economic. I think the first one I would mention is, of course, that since this commission took office, it's very clear that decarbonization of the economy is the key priority. The Green Deal has been from the start the main driver of many of the European Commission initiatives. And we have seen that this is done basically through legislation. We had a huge number of legislative initiatives during this term. I mean, the term is not over yet, so we're still expecting much more to be implemented. But most of them are around the Green Deal. So how to decarbonize the economy, the European economy, and this is done both through horizontal pieces of legislation, but also through sectorial pieces of legislation. So this is the main point. We have a complete revolution in terms of production and also in terms of technologies that will be used in the future, from steel to automotive manufacturing, without forgetting chemicals, pharmaceuticals, etc. So we have a lot of legislation with very strict conditions and very strict targets, which means that the European industry is confronted with quite some challenges, how to remain competitive while doing this transition to a more decarbonized economy. This means we will have also to invest a lot, invest in new technologies, invest in new products, and this sometimes takes time. So we are running against the clock. And this is one important aspect, because it explains some of the initiatives I will be talking later, particularly the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure. So that is the first driver. Then we have, of course, the war in Ukraine. And this has been quite impactful for the European Union in terms of political, from a political point of view, but also from an economic point of view. From a political point of view, it's clear that this brought the West and the Western allies, but also many countries in Asia that share similar views of Western values closer together. And we have seen a reinforcement of NATO, we have seen a reinforcement of the transatlantic alliance, and we have seen a coordinated approach and a coordinated response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So even on things like sanctions, the support that is being given to Ukraine, both from an economic point of view, but also from a military point of view. So this has been a huge event for Europe. And of course, also put in question from an economic point of view, our dependencies from Russia, particularly on the energy and the gas side. You know that Europe and some big economies in Europe, especially the German economy, depended a lot on imported gas from Russia. That was relatively cost effective as compared to other sources. And this dependency was definitely one of the key elements that spurred the debate in Europe over the last months, because of course we have seen initially a huge increase in the energy prices. Just to give you an idea, between 2019 and the peak of prices of gas in 2022, we have an increase of more than 1,100%. So you can see how this was impactful. While, of course, there were also increases in energy in other regions. I mean, in the US, about 200%, and in Japan, 100%. So the difference is enormous. So this led, of course, to a whole debate about dependencies in Europe and why we should not repeat the same mistake that we did with Russia on gas. And of course, in the current geopolitical context, with increasing tensions between the US and China, this is very much the debate right now, is how we should decrease some of the dependencies we have on China, for instance, on critical raw materials. So dependencies is becoming, for the last months in particular, one of the big points of discussion in Europe. And this explains also another piece of legislation that I will talk about more in particular, and that's the Critical Raw Materials Act. The third main driver of the debate is, surprisingly, a US initiative that we know that in Korea has also been discussed, that is the US Inflation Reduction Act. Because, of course, as I said in the beginning, Europe's decarbonization process has been a priority for this commission, so for the last 3 to 4 years. But the fact is that driving the process is legislation, a lot of legislation, some of it quite difficult for companies to implement, while the US has not done much in terms of legislation, but has created a mechanism with Inflation Reduction Act to promote, to incentivize investments in decarbonization of the economy, in green technologies, in green goods. So the fact that you have a huge, massive plan of support to decarbonization efforts in the US has led, of course, to a strong competition in terms of investment between the US and Europe. With many European companies, many of them have, of course, already investments in the US, but some of these investments have become more important due to the fact there is strong support from the US government to these investments, these green investments. So the US has become very attractive in an area where the EU, in many cases, was in a leading position. So, and this also created, of course, a big debate in Europe on whether we have the best option in terms of decarbonizing our economy based, as I said, in regulation, or is the US the best solution because instead of using regulation, they created a business case that makes it very attractive to decarbonize and to invest in green technology. So this has been a huge debate, it still is, because of course, apart from the fact that we are all very happy that the US has embarked in this process of decarbonization, the way it is doing it creates a lot of problems, including by the fact that many of the provisions introduced in the US Inflation Reduction Act are discriminatory. They force localization of investments in the US, and the incentives are given accordingly to these investments in the US and the fact that you produce basically in the US with US components. And of course, this is also putting in question the whole economic model that is the basis of the transatlantic economy. We have a very strong relationship with US that is basically centered on investments. There's a lot of US investment in Europe, there's a lot of European investment in the US, and of course, this investment also favors trade. We don't produce everything in the US, so we import a lot from Europe through our companies that are in the US and vice versa. So if you are creating a system where you need to produce everything in the US to be able to get a subsidy, so you're also putting in question this model that has been at the center of the transatlantic economy. So this whole discussion around the US Inflation Reduction Act has created a lot of shockwaves in Europe, but it was also, I think it also had positive elements. And the main positive element for us is that it brought back again to the center stage the importance of having a European economy that remains competitive. If we want to decarbonize, we need to be able to compete and we need to be able to grow in Europe to make sure that we create the conditions for further investment and for further decarbonization efforts. So bringing back at the center stage of the debate the importance of European competitiveness was and is still one of the positive elements of the US Inflation Reduction Act. We saw as a response that the European Union came up with a Green Deal industrial plan. And this means that there is a recognition that you need other policies. You cannot just impose the Green Deal and the green transformation without coming up with some alternative policies that allow you to grow. One of them, and this is a very welcoming point from our side, is the fact that, for instance, you need to continue a very ambitious trade agenda, and you need to open new market opportunities for our companies to export, but also to import. So a strong focus on the trade agreements was one of the important elements of this Green Deal industrial plan. And it is important really that we keep investments in Europe. I mean, we normally do what we call our reform barometer, where we make inquiries to our members on what is the general situation in terms of their European competitiveness. And we also monitor the investment attractiveness of Europe. And what we have seen is that the foreign direct investment inflows for the EU, they fell by 66% in 2021 compared to 2019. And for instance, in the US, in the same period of time, they grew by 63%. So there is a clear disadvantage at the moment in terms of attractiveness of investments of the EU as compared to the US. So we need to change. And this process of change is now taking place. I mean, it's not ideal yet, but we see a change in the political message, but also in some initiatives that the EU is taking to take more into account the need to have economic growth in Europe and the need to maintain investments in Europe. As I said, the trade agreements is one, but we're also discussing legislative initiatives like the Net Zero Act that intends precisely to address some of the problems we have as compared to the US. It provides additional support for investments in decarbonizing our economy for companies in Europe, but is also tackling issues like improving the processes of investing, including reducing the permitting procedure. So this is another consequence of the US Inflation Reduction Act. Now, taking into account these debates, I will talk more in particular about three initiatives, starting with the Critical Raw Materials Act. As I mentioned, this is a response to the need to diversify and also the need to depend less from suppliers that could become risky in the future. I mean, we know that the situation in Asia Pacific is not ideal, also in terms of increasing in the tensions in the region, the prospects of China possibly invading Taiwan, but also the fact that the US is, of course, more and more restrictive in terms of exports to China or certain technologies. This is, of course, raising concerns in Europe, considering that in many of the critical raw materials that we need for the decarbonization of our economy, we depend on China. And this is raising, of course, a lot of alarm in Europe. I have to say that we as business very much share the view of the Commission that the idea here is not to decouple from China, but we definitely need to de-risk in the sense that we need to reduce some of the exposure to China in some of these important strategic areas like critical raw materials. So with this legislation, the Commission intends on one end to improve, of course, if possible, mining, extracting and processing in Europe. And we are working also on how to make these processes easier. And of course, this has to do, again, with the issues regarding permitting, making permitting faster. But of course, it also has to do with the sense that we need to change the public opinion in Europe that in general is not very favorable to extractive industries. So this is also, we need to change a bit here the perception in the public about this sector. And then it's a lot about focusing also on recycling. We need to reuse more the materials. We need to recycle more these materials. to also reduce the needs in terms of extracting and mining. So this is one aspect. And then the other aspect, of course, that is very important is diversification through imports. And here we are also doing important steps in our trade agreements. We are becoming more and more, this chapter that we have on raw materials and energy is becoming more and more important. And we are becoming more strategic in terms that we are trying, of course, also in the relations with our trading partners to factor this aspect in the relationship. So for us, it's very important, for instance, to conclude the agreement with Australia that we are still negotiating, and of course to ratify the agreement with Chile, just to give you two examples of two countries that are very important in this new policy of diversification of access to raw materials. At the same time, one aspect that is also important of this Critical Raw Materials Act is to ensure that supply chains are resilient. So in the sense, there is a strong push on the aspect that we need to control these supplies. We need to ensure we know when we see that there will be problems ahead, when we know that we have shortages coming, when we know that on a certain material, even if today there is a situation where we have enough availability, in the future, this might be the case. So there's a lot of monitoring, a lot of gathering information, also with the support of business. We just want to make sure that on this aspect that has to do with having access to information from business and requiring business to provide this information, that we are not overburdening companies, and that, of course, all the confidentiality is preserved, because a lot of this information is quite business sensitive. And that, of course, we have a good governance of this legislation. We want to make sure the whole process is relatively effective. We have sometimes the tendency, especially after COVID, we see governments regulating a lot and interfering a lot in the private sector and in the economy. And we want to make sure that this is not overstretched in the way that we are creating very heavy governance structures, and that this will in fact create more problems than solve them. So this piece of legislation is at relatively initial stage, in the sense that it was presented by the Commission, and it's now the debates with the co-legislation, so both with the European Parliament and the Council are starting. I mean, we as Business Europe in general are supportive of the initiative. But as I said, we need to ensure a good balance between the objectives we want to achieve and the way to achieve it. So for us, it's important that we work on all fronts. So diversification, recycling, extracting and processing in an equal way, because we need them all. And we also need to ensure that this is done in close coordination with business, that business is heard, also when it comes to monitoring supply chains and providing information. Because otherwise we risk creating, as I said, a bureaucratic monster, something we don't want to. I mean, it's one of the problems we have already now with many of these initiatives, is that they impose a lot of burden on companies in terms of reporting, in terms of procedures they need to do to match the requirements of the legislation, and this is really becoming a big issue. The other piece of legislation I would like to bring, and I know that this is also important for Korea, is the carbon border adjustment measure. So this one is, of course, a consequence of the Green Deal and the fact that the EU is so ambitious in terms of decarbonization and reaching the target of net zero for its industry. This means that, of course, we are quite conscious that we might face competition from others that are less ambitious or have different ways of achieving this ambition. Of course, ideally, we should have all the same ambition, and ideally, the best way would be that we all have similar approaches on how to achieve it, but this is not the reality. And of course, we are very worried about potential carbon leakage that will come of the fact that especially high energy intensive sectors that are already under huge pressure because of the increased cost, as I mentioned in the beginning, will be severely impacted by the fact that we have very ambitious targets in terms of climate change, while others are not, and we are in direct competition both in European market and in third countries market. We also need to point it out that, of course, in the European Union, we have a carbon price, and this is not the reality in many of our competitors, including developed countries like the US. And of course, the fact that we are reducing some of the mitigation factors that we have for our industry, and I'm talking about what we call the free allocations in terms of the ETS, the emissions trading system in Europe. This is creating additional problems for our companies. So we are going to phase out these free allocations in Europe, meaning companies will have to pay more for the carbon. And if we are not putting in place some mitigation measures regarding imports, of course, this would create more of distortion in the European market. So that is the objective of the CBAM, is to try to equalize the carbon price in Europe to that of imported products. Now, this is not an easy process because, of course, as I said in the beginning, we sometimes share the objective, but we don't have the same means. And in many regions around the world, we do not have a carbon price. So it's how we're going to conciliate the two systems. This is something that we will have to still see, because right now the Commission is defining what kind of methodology would be put in place to calculate the carbon embedded emissions in the products that will be imported and therefore will be potentially subject to the CBAM. So right now, we know that the CBAM is not going to be fully implemented of this year. So we will have a transition period, but this transition period starts in October already this year with reporting. So meaning importers, of course, will have to report on emissions, on embedded emissions in the products they are importing on a regular basis, and provide also additional information of their imported sources. We are waiting for guidance from the European Commission that should come in the coming months, meaning until July, also on how this reporting is going to be done. So right now, I understand, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, both from European companies, importers, but also from exporters, including in Korea, but also in other countries, how the information is going to be provided and how the information is going to be treated. From our perspective, what it is important is that this system works well in the sense that we do not want to discriminate imports. That's very clear. We want to put the imported products at the same level of the products that are produced in Europe. But of course, we still, that's an important aspect, as we are going to phase out these free allocations, we in European industry are still in a situation where we considered we are in a not so level position as compared to producers in other countries, because in third countries markets, we will not have the CBAM, and therefore we'll be facing competition. We will have an higher carbon price, an higher energy cost, and of course this creates a lot of problems in competing in third markets. So we're still seeing how this situation will impact in future in the competitive of these industries in global markets. Then I think it's important, of course, that we make sure that we have a good communication about the CBAM towards our trading partners. I know there's a lot at the moment, a lot of question marks about it. We also have them in Europe, so it's not just third countries that don't know yet how this is going to be implemented. But we are hoping that in the coming 2 months, we will have more clarity, and there we will have then the transition period to make sure that this new instrument works well when it starts really to be implemented in the terms that when people start to pay, if they have to pay the tax. So this is on CBAM, and my final initiative that I will bring is the Corporate Sustainable Responsibility and Due Diligence initiative. That is quite complex. It has to do, of course, the main objective is to have more sustainable supply chains, not just in Europe, but around the world. And the basis is that European companies, but also, of course, companies operating in Europe will need to be more careful about their supply chains, but also parts of the downstream. So there's a big debate still whether we are talking about supply chains or value chains, but I will go there a bit later into more detail. But the idea indeed is that we control better what is happening around the supply chains. We make sure that production is done in a way that respects minimum standards, both in terms of climate, for instance, respect with commitments in the Paris climate agreement, but also when it comes to ILO provisions on social aspects, and also other aspects that have to do with human rights, for instance, will be considered. So the idea is really that we have a more sustainable supply chains, but of course, a lot of the responsibility will fall on companies. And what we don't want is that this legislation will create so much problems for companies also to subcontract and to engage with partners in third countries that in the end they will disengage. So this will be the worst possible option, is that you create such a difficult environment with so many restraints, with so many constraints, with so many consequences, because you can be liable if it's found out that you're certainly around your supply chain, you're not fulfilling any of these or some of these commitments or criteria, that actually you will face liability. You will possibly need to pay compensation remedies. So this could lead in a way to companies deciding that risk is too big in certain markets and then disengage. So the process is still not finished here. We are still discussing at the European Parliament. It's very, very difficult from a political point of view as well, because of course the business community is not totally happy, to say the least, with what the Commission has proposed. And the debates in the European Parliament have been very heated over the last months. And we had a recent vote 2 weeks ago in the URI committee of the European Parliament, that is the leading committee in this file. But we are now preparing for the plenary, a vote that should take place the 1st of June. But as I said, the debates are still very heated among the political groups, especially within the European People's Party, because there's a lot of sense that the proposal that is there as the compromise proposal from the European Parliament is still very negative for companies. It will still create a lot of problems with implementation. And what are some of these problems? And I would only target some of them. Well, first, we are talking about a directive. So we're not talking about regulation. This means that you leave some room for a non-harmonized implementation across the EU, with a possibility, including that some governments decide to go further and adopt their own legislation. And this is something we want to avoid. So we're trying to tighten a bit the language here to make sure that we really have an harmonized approach within the EU. The other aspect is we have been discussing whether we're talking about value chains. And if we were talking initially, the idea was to have value chains. If we have value chains, we have downstream as well as upstream. And you know how difficult it is already to control upstream, because sometimes we have a lot of suppliers, not just tier 1 suppliers, tier 2, tier 3, and it's very difficult to control. So if on top of it, you are going also to have to control what happens afterwards, what happens when the product goes to the consumer, and then the recycling of the product as well. So we are trying to limit a little bit, but we will still end up with some of the downstream aspects, including, you know, issues like waste management. So this is another aspect that for us it's critical. Then the other aspect is, of course, the size of companies and the time companies will have to implement the legislation. I mean, we are trying to exclude the smaller companies, but of course they will be impacted, even if they are excluded from the legislation, because in the end, if they are part of the supply chain, they will have to comply with the obligations in a way. But the idea now is that you really cover only companies with more than 250 employees, and that you have different timelines for the bigger companies and shorter timelines, and longer timelines for the others. So we're talking, for instance, about 3 years for the ones with more than 1,000 employees, 4 years for the ones with 500 plus 500, and 5 years for the ones with more than 250 employees. So this is important. The other important aspect for us is that we stick to general standards when we are assessing the risk in our supply chains, and that we stick as close as possible, for instance, with the OECD guidelines that are the more accepted and implemented standards when it comes to corporate due diligence. Then I think the other important aspect is to try to mitigate as much as possible responsibility of companies when they have in place their own systems already, because many companies have due diligence systems in place. We want to make sure that these systems are recognized, and if they are not recognized, at least that they are taken into account when it comes to risk assessment, because otherwise this means we are simply ignoring what the companies have been doing and putting in place for many years. And then the other aspect we want to make sure is that we restrain the responsibilities of board members. And initially there were some ideas, including to have criminal liability for board members, and this would create serious problems, and it would definitely lead many companies to disengage from certain operations in certain countries, or engaging with certain partners that could be more risky. So right now, the debate is not over. So we don't know in the end what will be the final legislation, but we are expecting it will be quite impactful in terms of how European companies develop their supply chains and engage with partners, including partners in third countries. And therefore, I think this is something that, of course, interests you and should interest you. We want to make sure, of course, that this remains reasonable, or as reasonable as possible. But I must say at the moment, we are not very optimistic because the debate is quite difficult, with a strong push from NGOs, but also from trade unions, to push companies to do more and to engage more and to restrain more their operations if these operations do not match certain conditions. So, Christoph, I will end here my intervention, but happy to respond to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. So I think the Q&A box is still empty. Yeah, so I can only encourage, let's say, people to enter questions, because I'm not that smart, but of course I have some questions. But we have somebody. Okay. Let's have a look. So this is a long question, so maybe I just read it. So presentation was from Michael Peck. So this presentation was very helpful, a clear, coherent, and comprehensive explanation on what's going on, including also the most relevant interconnections and interdependencies, which I've been trying and failing to put together. Thank you. It's not a question, but it's a thank you. Okay. So maybe then I start with some question, maybe a simple one. So carbon border adjustment mechanism, Luisa, good or bad? Very simple, good or bad initiative?
Well, I would say is not the ideal initiative. We would prefer a different approach, and I think from the start we have been clear. It would be better that we have all the same ambition and that we use all the same criteria to achieve it. So it's not an ideal solution. First, because it will create it is creating trade frictions. That's number one. A second, because of course the sectors that are covered are not totally happy, because they feel that the measure is not going to be a total replacement to the phase out of the free allocations. And that's why one of the things we were asking is that before you implement a measure, or while implementing the measure, you need to make sure that it is effective before you phase out the free allocations. But this was not the political decision of the Commission. So we are basically walking into a void, in the sense that we are going to experiment something new that is supposed to be a replacement of something we knew that worked well in the last years, but we are going to have something we don't know it's going to work, and we know it's going to create a lot of problems in implementing, and also in making sure that our trading partners understand it and know how to use it. And of course, I mean, we have more uncertainties right now because we don't know yet which countries will be covered or not covered. For instance, will the US be covered? Because we are now discussing a green and sustainable steel and aluminium arrangement. We understand that the US is seeing this as a potential alternative not to be subject to the CBAM, but of course, for us, this is we need to be very careful, because if we are, including Korean companies or Japanese companies in the CBAM, why not include American ones? So we need to be consistent here as well in implementing the measure, or this should not be only for China. And of course, in the end, what can happen is, of course, everyone will send to Europe is greener products. And all the other ones, the ones that are more polluted, more carbon intensive, will be sent somewhere else. But then the question is, what is going to happen in the third markets with these products and the competition around these products? So these are some of the questions. So it's not it's not great, but at the moment, I mean, this is what we have, is the tool that we have, and since the other tool is disappearing, we need to have something.
Okay, so maybe one more question from my side, then after we go back to the Q&A chat. So actually, the EU is considered as one of the global standard setters. So it's the US and the EU who is in the position to set up global standards. So my question is simply, so if CBAM is considered to be the best, a good policy tool, why are there not efforts, let's say, to make it a global standard, so an agreement also from the peers of the EU, so it's a G20 OECD. So if there could be one common agreement or a common approach, I think this would be much easier also for business, except instead of having in many different countries, many different setups. So the question is, why is nobody going for a kind of global solution?
No, I think the idea is indeed a good one, and there are some attempts. I mean, I know that the WTO is working, for instance, on some standards, potential standards to measure carbon embedded emissions, for instance, on the steel sector. But of course, the problem is you have different political perceptions on whether carbon price is the best way to achieve decarbonization. And all the problems stem from there. If we all had the same approach that this would be the best way to achieve decarbonization, then I think things would be easier. I mean, we know that some countries are considering it, including countries like Australia, but you need really to consider that this approach of having a carbon price is the best way. If you don't, and you have countries like the US or Japan that have always been reluctant to have this as the best approach, it's going to be very difficult to achieve a world standard. But of course, that would be the best, I would say. And preferably, if we have a carbon price, then we will not have the need for a CBAM.
Okay, good. So now questions are popping in. And so the next question is, I think it's a kind of abbreviation, AV. So thanks for the talk. Regarding the green plan, if you could wave a magic wand, which would be 3 solutions? Additionally, which would be 3 metrics for success?
I think the 3 metrics for success would be that, of course, we achieve the goals of decarbonizing the economy, but we still manage to retain investment in Europe and possibly investment in more of these green technology sectors, that we create more jobs in these sectors, and at the same time that we make sure that the impact on the rest of the sectors that might not be so successful in the future is not creating too much, or is not hampering too much the economy. I think this is the measures of success, and of course that we retain our competitiveness worldwide. I mean, Europe is a big exporter around the world, and it's important that we retain also this leadership. So I think this would be the measures of success.
Okay, so we're moving to the next question. So I have to open the window. So from Narada Jaya Tilaka, hopefully the pronunciation is correct. So the question is, will new regulation affecting raw materials also affect finished goods that are imported to Europe from Asian region?
Well, the Critical Raw Materials Act is basically directed to raw materials. So one of the impacts that could potentially have on imported raw materials, so we're talking about raw materials here, is that those raw materials are subject to a footprint declaration. And this footprint declaration, we are trying to make sure that is something light, and only demanded in certain conditions, because of course we want the imported raw materials to be as sustainable as possible. But considering the situation we have, I mean, we have problems of availability on many of these raw materials and very strong competition. I mean, let's talk about lithium just now. We on magnesium, I mean, we have a lot of competition because we are all decarbonizing, we're all electrifying at the same time. So there's a lot of competition for these materials. So we need to be careful not to demand too much on our suppliers, because this will make it less attractive to export to Europe, or it will make the cost of the product very high, and therefore, I mean, will make our final product less competitive. But no, for the moment, this will have an impact. It's basically on raw materials, not on finished products. I mean, the finished products could be impacted by other legislation. Not this one, definitely due diligence, or the legislation like deforestation or the forced labor ban. This would impact more the semi-finished and finished products. Yeah.
Great. So Jean-Michel Perret, so he was asking if he could get a copy of the presentation. Of course, there was none. Question, Luisa, can we upload the presentation as a video, or is this you prefer not to do?
I'm fine if you upload it as video, no problem.
Okay, so we do the video. Yeah. So Dirk Hoffman, yeah, so he's referring to the reporting on raw materials and sustainability. Is the current system of reporting expected to be extended extensively? Question. Is there a way of an increased exchange between partner countries so that the companies are less burdened?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems we have. We have huge reporting requirements in the area of sustainability. And I mean, we as Business Europe launched a call for action, because we see, I mean, in this inquiry we did to our members, we saw that the first problem that companies have in Europe has to do with high energy costs, but the second problem is the regulatory burden. And a lot of the regulatory burden comes from the reporting requirements. I mean, and what I want to stress is these reporting requirements, we are at the initial stage. I mean, many of these legislative initiatives are still being discussed. So we will only see the full impact in a year or so in some of them. But we are very conscious that this is going to become a big, big problem. And so we are trying to push the Commission also to work in these areas to reduce the reporting requirements. And we think we have been relatively successful, because the Commission President has said that they would work on reducing legislation and reporting. 25% was the target. So we will keep insisting on this. And whenever a new legislation comes up, we will try to make sure that this reporting is really minimum and that we use information available, because that's the other thing. I mean, sometimes with one reporting could be used for other pieces of legislation, and this is not done, and therefore companies are repeating the same information over and over again. And by the way, I mean, it's not just a problem for companies, it's also a problem for the public authorities, because they will have to deal also with this information that is being provided by companies, so they don't have the resources to do it. So I think right now, sometimes politicians do not have full perception of how serious this problem is. But I think very soon this will happen when we start implementing some of this legislation, and we will see also the consequences. But we are still confident that we will try and we can reduce some of these reporting requirements. Yeah. Okay.
So as I'm not an expert, I don't know if the next question is somehow overlapping. Are the reporting requirements according to ISO standards, PAS 250, etc., or is it still yet to be decided?
Oh, I mean, these reporting requirements vary according to legislation. So it's not, I cannot tell you it's going to be a standard for the reporting requirements, because they are very much in terms of the information you provide and the evidence that you need to provide. It's different according to the pieces of legislation. So there will not be one standard. No. And this is one of the challenges.
Yeah. So to be honest, I'm a bit pessimistic about deregulation, because this is a topic for many, many years. I think in every country, in every legislation, and so far there are only a few countries that have set up a good system. But the majority of countries are actually adding up reporting requirements, laws to comply with, etc., and not really having launched successful initiatives on deregulation. So maybe the Critical Raw Materials Act. So I was, so I know. So in Europe, it is primarily understood as safeguarding access to critical raw materials, so that we have at least a certain percentage, let's say, yes, insured for future production. So I have also heard from some countries actually that that they are not happy, because it seems that now the EU is egoistically trying to keep those access to critical raw materials and not sharing those with like-minded partner countries. Have you heard something similar from, let's say, around the world, or is it maybe kind of Korean private opinion?
No, I think the EU is actually even proposing a critical raw materials club, and the idea would be to have, you know, partnerships between countries that want the raw materials, so that share the same goals in terms of you know, common principles and common standards, and the countries that have the raw materials. So there's even this proposal. So no, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think, on the contrary, the EU is willing to work with other partners that share similar principles on, and who also want to of course de-risk some of their supplies. So on this, I think there is a willingness to cooperate, but of course we know we are all competing with each other, and this is very clear. But I think the part from the European side, there is a willingness to cooperate and try to team up and make sure that we help each other as well. I mean, I have to say, we had 2 weeks ago the B7 summit, so the business of the 7 summit in Tokyo. And this issue was very much at the center of the discussions between the business community. I mean, we of course have the same problems, and we are competing, but we also need to make sure that we show more solidarity between us. And if there is a problem with one country, that the others can also step in. And of course, that the idea is this should not be limited also to G7 countries, because we don't want, you know, this to be the club of the rich, but also try to involve countries that share similar principles, and also make sure that they are part of these clubs, whatever it's raw materials or trade on investment. So this is very much the sense that the business community has, and the politicians, at least in Europe, that is the sense. Yeah.
So now we have 2 minutes. We have 2 more questions. So I think maybe we can take those questions. Jean-Michel is pretty active. Yeah. So he understands that the extra burden that can come from extra reporting, but there is a plan to have those reporting verified by third parties. So it's mostly related to audit.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yes, there is, and also here, I mean, it depends on the legislation, but indeed, there is that. And one of the things we are discussing, for instance, in the due diligence, is who is going to pay for those reporting, because of course some want the company, the main company, the one that has to do the due diligence, to pay for those reporting. So absolutely, the idea is that you have this verify, and the same goes for initiatives like CBAM, of course.
Okay, yeah, that was also my opinion. So last question from my end. So CBAM will start with 5 industry segments of 5 products, focusing on high carbon intensity. Do you think that the scope will be expanded later on to other consumer goods?
Yes, there is a possibility. I mean, we had some sectors that wanted at one point to be included. There were talks about at one point including particular sectors like chemicals, for instance. But I think, considering all the issues we had already at this stage, for the moment there is caution on whether new sectors will be included. But the idea is to expand, but to expand primarily, of course, to the ones that are covered by the ETS, so the emission trading system. So we are still talking about high energy intensive sectors. But we need first to see how it goes in implementation before expanding. Yes.
Okay, great. So I think we have covered all the questions. We have learned a lot, yeah, directly from Brussels. So I appreciate a lot your time, your insights, Luisa. And we are a bit delayed in time, so we are 1 minute above. But I think it's no problem, because it was worth it. Yeah, so big thanks to you for your presentation. Big thanks to the audience. And I would like to close. Wish you a nice remaining day. See you soon, wherever you are. And yeah, goodbye.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and thanks to everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.